This is a panel discussion on bridging group of 7, G7, and the group of 20, G20, intersecting research and policy making. So as I said, the think tank's role is bridge research and policy making. But also we can bridge other things. And then, especially this time, the bridging G7 and the G20 is very, very important because of this increasing risk, instability, et cetera, and also those instability, uncertainty, and risk are coming from the technology side, so technological disruptions happening, and that will change our life, and also coming from geo-economic conflict, tensions, and then geopolitical tension, and then, unfortunately, conflicts. So, how to bridge? And then the one way is the close collaboration of T7 and T20. Of course, other engagement groups are already working together between the 7 and 20. But as the think tank groups, it's new, relatively new, to have this T7 and T20 close collaboration. But I think this close collaboration between think tank, groups has significance because think tanks is more neutral, while the other engagement groups has always, their own say, the fixed assertion. Like a science group usually say, promote science and use science more. And then women 7, women 20, yeah, of course, women and girls empowerment, right? So, but think tanks do not have such a fixed say. But in other words, it's more neutral. And also, think tanks care the use of science and more science-based, evidence-based policy making. So I want to start this discussion about bridging group G7 and G20 through a video message. Sherpa and Sous Sherpa are people who navigate a huge number of events, ministerial meetings, and also the summit. Am I correct? Sous Sherpa, Nakamura-san. So Sherpa's role is navigating this G7 or G20 process. So the Amitabh Kant is a leader of G20 Sherpa group. He's a Sherpa. And then we have Renana Javara, who is a leader of big women group called Self-Employed Women's Association, Seva Bharat, in India. Her group is working at really the front line of economic development and helping the women and girls. And then Elizabeth E., who is the Executive Vice President of Program at Rockefeller Foundation. Rockefeller Foundation is a great supporter of this idea of the bridging G7 and the G20. And then I skipped the detailed introduction because everybody should have this set of bio with photos. Okay, so please look at this bios. And then there are panelists. First, the Mr. Kazuhiko Nakamura, Deputy Director General, Deputy Assistant Minister, and Ambassador and the Economic Affairs Bureau, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is a Sous Sherpa of G7 this time. Thank you very much. And then Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, Director General, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, the lead chair of Think20, T20 India, and also he was the ambassador from India to Japan. And then Professor Bambang Brojonegoro, former finance minister of Indonesia, and the lead co-chair of T20 Indonesia 2022. And also, he is a T7 Japan Advisory Board member. Thank you very much, Bambang. And then Professor Kazuhiko Takeuchi, the president, Institute for Global Economic Strategy, IGS, and he is also T7 Japan Advisory Board member. Thank you very much, Takeuchi-sensei. And then Professor Yukari Takamura, Vice President for International Affairs, Science Council of Japan, and she is a professor at the Institute for Future Initiative, University of Tokyo, and Science 7 Japan, or G Science Academics meeting. Thank you very much. And then Ms. Mariko Kinai, National Director of World Vision Japan and the co-chair of Japan Civil Society Coalition on G7 Summit. So this group is called C7. Then she is a steering committee member of the C7. Kinai-san, thank you very much for coming. So let's start the presentation. So Ambassador Amitabh Kant, please start.
My fellow panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we meet at a defining moment in history. In the last 4 years, our people have endured one crisis after another, which has tested their resolve to the limit. Taken together, these crises have not only set back hard-won gains in health, education, and productivity, but also threatened the very future of our generations. Together with the inexorable and destructive march of the climate crisis, we collectively face the biggest challenges that the global community has seen in nearly a century. We live in one world and our future is intertwined. Polarization will weigh on future growth. Inaction and impasse will be the ultimate failure of leadership. And therefore, it's very important that T7 and G7 and T20 and G20 all work together to achieve common goals for, to my mind, what are the key priorities of G20 and G7 together. Firstly, accelerated, inclusive, and resilient growth. The COVID pandemic came on the heels of a very half century of falling productivity. It was a health, economic, and social disaster. Children in all countries missed at least a full year's schooling. And therefore, to my mind, given that health, skills, and knowledge that people accumulate over their lifetimes are the most important determinants of productivity, these learning losses have been critical, and we need to realize that inequality has risen sharply both within and between countries. Only rapid, broad-based, sustained, and resilient growth can reverse this trend. Secondly, green development and climate finance. For 300 years, scientists have known about the pernicious effects of greenhouse gas emission. For over a century, public policy makers have known how to control negative externalities. Yet the climate crisis marches on unabated year after year. We have reached a tipping point as extreme weather events have worsened and many regions of the world face record temperature. Fossil fuel consumption has increased rather than decreased. Unchecked, the climate crisis resulting in famines, flood, fires, extreme heat will lead to a breakdown of our planet. The planet may survive, but human beings will be extinct. And therefore, a breakthrough is needed now, underpinned by science and significantly more financing from both the developed world and from private sector for mitigation efforts. Thirdly, accelerating progress on SDGs. Almost every indicator of progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals has seen a setback, and the goals we set for ourselves for 2030 and now all but unattainable. The pandemic has been inequitable with buffers across all sectors all but gone. And therefore, our collective resolve across the board, supporting by breakthroughs in science, the financing architecture, as well as utilizing the digital transformation underway to deliver services, the last mile will shape the world we want to see for our future generation. And therefore, providing adequate resources and accelerating implementation on sustainable development goals is key. Fourthly, multilateral institutions for the 21st century. It's important to understand that these institutions were constituted after post-World War II in the post-Bretton Woods period. The arc of history is now firmly traveling through the global south, a region that will provide the labor force and investment opportunities to drive the bulk of global growth for the rest of the century. And therefore, multilateral institutions capable of operating in the 21st century and providing resources for sustainable development goals and for climate action will require reformed mandates and governance structures, with the latter recognizing the economic weight of the global south. Our institutions must embrace this necessity, without which we'll never meet our goals. Fourthly, technological transformation and digital public infrastructure. Digital public infrastructure pioneered in the United States with the internet needs to be nurtured globally as it enables countries to leapfrog evolutionary development processes. The COVID pandemic has demonstrated their powers. Countries like India with effective digital public infrastructure could provide emergency fiscal transfers to hundreds of millions. Their health system could support and coordinate vaccine deployment across large populations. Their education systems could offer platform for learning, and their digital commerce platform augmented by digital payment systems could blunt the worst ravages of the lockdown. And therefore, we need to develop institutions that serve the global interest in the digital space through digital public infrastructure. And fifthly, gender equality and women-led development. Inclusion is a fundamental tenet of every society. The multi-layered crisis described above has stalled progress towards gender equality, and the risk of reversal is intensifying. It is a social, moral, and economic imperative to have gender equality and women-led development. Our efforts at reviving growth, fighting climate change, and developing a shared, sustainable future must have gender equality at its core. Ladies and gentlemen, G7 and G20 are two important global forums deliberating on major issues facing the world now, such as meeting SDGs, climate change, recovery from pandemic, debt crisis, supply chain disruptions, rising food and energy prices. Although G7 is hailed as an advanced country club whose members are also part of G20, there are a number of common areas both the groupings could work together for synergistic impact at the global level. Setting aside the political differences and the composition of membership, the convergence in conceptual approaches, and at broader paradigm level could be turned into a win-win situation for both G7 and G20. T7 Japan and T20 India present several avenues for joint and collective action by both the groupings. For instance, Task Force 2 of T7 and Task Force 3, 4, and 6 of T20 cover issues of environmental sustainability, just energy transition, and well-being as measures. Task Force 3 of T20 on lifestyle for environment promotes an integrated approach towards sustainable production and consumption, integrates values and ethics into standard metrics of well-being beyond GDP. With similar mandate, both Task Force 2 of T7 and Task Force 3 of T20 can come up with joint similar plans and future roadmap to offer solutions to achieve SDGs. Enhance climate adaptation efforts, ensure green transition, and catalyze enablers of this change, such as resilient infrastructure, skilling, and innovative financing. Ladies and gentlemen, T7 and T20 are critical and significant. And so, their inputs into G7 and G20 will be the core of what we take forward into the leaders' recommendation, and we look forward to your recommendations. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Sherpa Amitabh Kant, for energetic and extremely comprehensive and also insightful speech, including, as usual, the kind of stressing the Indian success in digital transformation, but at the same time sending us a very clear message about the bridging G7 and the G20. Thank you very much. Now let's move to the second speaker, Renana Jabara from, she's connected with us online from India. Renana, please start. Screen is yours. You're muted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this very important session. I will be speaking on women's economic empowerment. And since it affects 50% of the population, it is an important topic for us. It's also very much there in the SDGs, in many of the SDGs. And actually, in many ways, conditions of women across the global north and the global south are very much similar. There's a lower participation in the labor force. Internationally, globally, 25% women are 25% less than men as far as labor force participation goes. As far as care goes, women give much more care than men do, internationally 3 times more care. Although, of course, the degree is different between North emerging economies and developing economies. Given these similarities, there are many solutions that we have to work together. And I also would like to say, as a participant of the women's movement for the last 40 years, I'd like to say that much of the change that has come in both the North and the South has come because of cooperation, both of governments as well as of women's groups, as well as of thinkers, perhaps thinkers and think tanks more than anyone else. However, given these similarities, the economies are very different. And so the extent and the scope of the solutions should be quite different. So some solutions are same, but the solutions need to be much more context specific. Similarities are at a certain conceptual level. For example, in the care economy, or for care, the slogan recognize, reduce, redistribute care is important across countries. But what I would like to focus on is let us look at some basic differences so that when G7 governments and when women's groups and academics from G7 countries think about or work with G20 countries and also developing countries, they may not be looking at exactly similar solutions. So I will now present something on the screen just to show you, just some photos and so on, to show you where the differences lie. So I'm going to share the screen now. Can you see the screen, please? Yes. So the main difference between the global north and the global south is the size of the informal economy. Worldwide, the size of the informal economy is 61%. What is the informal economy? It consists of informal workers, that is, workers who are have no social security, who work for a wage, but are very casual, who don't have any regular jobs. And it also consists of very small or even bigger self-employed, unregistered firms. But look at the difference. I've just given one difference, but we can look at the difference between all types of countries. So in India, the informal economy accounts for 90%. It's actually 89% of the total employment, compared to Germany, where it is 4%. So in this different kind of environment, what would be a different solution? I was asked actually to show you some photographs because many people in G7 countries don't even know what the informal economy looks like. These are from the members of SEBA, that is the organization I come from. These are women from the informal economy. So they're agriculture workers. On the right is women who make plates out of leaves. This is embroidery. A lot of the nice, beautiful embroidery you see, which comes out of India, is done by women. Weavers, these are handloom weavers making beautiful cloth. Domestic workers, data entry operators, and so on. So this is just a glimpse that I wanted to give you of the informal economy. Now let us look at the other big issue. Why women are not participating in the labor force? It's because of care. Because in all our countries, it is still believed that care is the responsibility of women. But care work is more onerous in the global south because not only are there fewer benefits, but in the south, domestic work includes the time spent in getting water, gathering firewood, and of course, childcare, elderly care, and all the other things which include cooking, etc. So that extra part of getting water and firewood, and that extra part of not having the kind of facilities and the kind of benefits that G7 has, does make a big difference. In India, for example, women with access to clean cooking fuel, many women are still using biofuels, that is wood, which they have to go out and gather. But as you can see on your right, this is a woman cooking on a stove with wood. But if you have clean cooking fuel, you can spend more time on paid work. And similarly, many people do not have a tap in their homes, although there's a big scheme from the government to try and get water in each home. But they often have to stand, as you can see on the right, and so they lose wages and they lose work because of that. I just wanted to visually show you what the differences are. And what that means, actually, is that in G7, there are certain types of work, certain types of solutions. For example, as I said, in G7 countries, most people are employed in jobs. And therefore, Social Security is the responsibility of the employers. So you have employers and the state working together for Social Security. In most G20 countries, and even more in developing countries, it should become much more the responsibility of the state. And certainly in India, the state has taken up a lot of the responsibility. However, still keep going back to the solutions which is given to us by G7. For example, maternity benefit. Now, as I said, 90% of women are informal. Therefore, employer-paid maternity leave does not apply to them. But it doesn't apply to them, and yet we have 6 months of maternity leave. And that often disincentivizes people in the corporate sector or in the formal sector. So there is another scheme that is possible, which is cash transfers for maternity benefit. Also, the Indian government has tried, but needs to be taken to a large scale, and which can be used in many of the other countries also. Specifically, there are a few solutions that we find are very useful to lower the gender gap in economic growth. And it's very important to bring women into the economic sphere, because that really boosts economic growth. It's a human rights issue also. I mean, after all, women also need to be equal, and that's very important to us. But it is also a booster of economic growth. So some solutions, as I said, are the same. Minimum wages, for example, that is a solution that both North and South have tried, and that is a good solution.
Renana, sorry, please wrap up soon. Yeah, we are enjoying, but please.
Now, yes, I will do so. So So the other two things were that in the South, we find that getting women together into collectives makes a very big difference rather than individual solutions. I just end by saying that we cannot change. It's a huge cultural and economic and social problem, and we will not be able to change unless we work together and unless we recognize that the circumstances are different. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Relana. So you are so clear from the lens of the gender equality, the similarities and the differences between the developed and the developing countries. And you raised important issues, and thank you very much for your insight. So I hope we'll have time to come back to you later. So the third speaker is Elizabeth E. Please start the video.
Konnichiwa, and hello from the Rockefeller Foundation's headquarters in New York City. My name is Elizabeth Yi, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Programs here at the Foundation. I wanted to say thank you to our partners, the T7, the G7, and the ADB Institute for inviting us to participate here with you today, and grateful that my colleague Dipali Khanna can be there with you in person. While I wish I could be as well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share a few words with you in advance of you hearing from this distinguished panel. Today, the world is facing a number of different crises, from COVID-19 to climate change to rising energy prices to rising commodity prices. This is creating significant inequity in our global world order and requires us to really think about how we can come together as a global community to deliver on a more just, equitable, and green future as a planet. It's really encouraging seeing how the groups are coming together to champion multilateralism, to think about how we can fight for a more representative world order and really address much of the challenges that we need to ensure that emerging and less developed economies have a chance to be part of this and have a seat at the table. The Rockefeller Foundation for 110 years has been committed to doing exactly the same as part of our efforts to make opportunity universal and sustainable. We empower policymakers around the globe to ensure that they have the means to invest in the scientific research and the innovations that we know we need in order to build a more equitable and just society. And what we do is we enhance individual and institutional capacities by making sure that we're pursuing ideas and implementation against the big bets that we know humanity needs to support people and frontline communities. And so as a result, we've been engaging closely with the T7 and T20 communities to understand and learn and build our vision and help support those communities to achieve that vision. So last year, one of the things we did was we supported a report that revealed that in order to reach net zero emissions, global, public, and private sector organizations needed to see annual investment flows of approximately $3.8 trillion by 2025. We also worked together with many partners to contribute to the G20 commissioned independent review panel for the capital adequacy frameworks, which made recommendations for boosting the investment capacity of the multilateral development banks. That work is part of our larger effort to really help the world build a global financial system and new architecture that enables us to be, as a global community, fit for purpose in the 21st century. We need to accelerate public and private sector financing in order to ensure that we achieve the energy transitions and the societal transitions we know we need to do in order to build towards this more sustainable development. That need was echoed by the chairs of the T20 India and T7 Japan, Ambassador Chinoy and Dean Sonube, along with other prominent global executives and leaders at a recent convening we held at our center in Bellagio, Italy, where we talked about building bridges between the G7 and the G20. That convening and this summit have the real potential to transform the global landscape and be able to help us deliver a global financial architecture that is more equitable and enables communities in emerging and developing economies to be part of the new green, and inclusive global economy. So I thank you for your commitment to cause. I wish you an incredibly productive and inspired convening, and we look forward to partnering with you on the path ahead.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your great support and encouragement. And as she mentioned, some of our members had a meeting in Bellagio, the northern Italy, to have, it's called retreat. And then we discussed deeply about this bridging idea. Then we came out lots of good ideas. So the participants included in this panelists. So I hope some of them will introduce some part of the result of the discussion at Bellagio. And I have basically three types of questions to panelists. One is what your responses to these presentations by three presenters. And second type of question, you can choose. Second type of question is what your expectations and what is expected difficulties in doing this bridging G7 and G20. And the third type of question, or you can mix or merge to second and third, or even first. What's your experience or your own effort about bridging G7 and the G20? So the first panelist, first speaker is Sue Sherpa, Ambassador Nakamura. Please start.
Yeah, thank you for giving such occasion, and thank you very much for very insightful statements made by previous speakers, which was very stimulating for me. And I'll try to answer your second and third questions. Our expectations to the sort of bridging or cooperation with the G20 is that, listening carefully Dr. Kant's statement, I, as the G7 presidency, Sushepa, realize there are several quite important fields or areas where our priority as the G7 and the Indian priority as the G20 presidency, I would say, coincides or converges, such as health, education, or development. Dr. Kant refers to the SDGs, and so on which we expect much that we could cooperate closely, and we, the G7 members, could provide helpful and stimulating inputs to the debates under the G20 presidencies. Yeah. Difficulties, of course, there are some which are at the same time inevitable, because naturally our priorities as the G7 presidency on the one hand, and Indian presidency's priorities in the context of the G20 cannot be 100% same. So we to overcome, to make closer coordination and build bridges between these different priorities, we need definitely closer coordination and dialogue, on which I personally am trying to work on. Maybe in overcoming these difficulties, what I try as the G7 presidency is to think beyond the Hiroshima summit and think about how we could pursue our G7's priorities by involving and cooperating with non-G7 partners, of course in the G20 context, and even beyond. That is one thing. And the second important aspect is definitely the dialogue and the receiving inputs from different G7 engagement groups, some of which involves very broadly non-G7 partners, including important G20 partners. That is the case for the C7, from which there are Ms. Kinai as a representative here, and that is the case also the T7 summit meeting this year, because you, as you rightly mentioned, involving a broad range of non-G7 partners, and which definitely will provide us, and I expect much, the inputs that would help us to better coordinate and a better interface with the G20 process under the Indian presidency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nakamura. So the one obvious merit of close collaboration between T7 and T20 is to create a new additional channel of communication between G7 and non-G7 G20 members, right? But how can we go further than that? Is there any additional benefit of close collaboration between T7 and T20? So including that, so I'd like to request Ambassador Chinoy to share your insight.
Thank you very much, Dean Sonube. I think it goes without saying that the T7 and T20 must work closely together, and it's a great privilege for me to be here in conversation with you. My first impression of the statements made so far and the discourse that we have heard so far is that everyone's very clear about the problems. It's the solutions that evade us. The first thing that strikes me is that we have now got into the habit of speaking of the T7 and T20 as very separate entities. And I'm suggesting here that it would be better to look at the G7 and the G20 as one particular monolith, because after all, the G7 is very much part of the G20. In fact, it's the most important plurilateral, a structured plurilateral that exists within the G20. The other plurilaterals that are there in this fractured world, such as the BRICS, etc., all of whom may be part of the G20, are not as well coalesced on building consensus. So I think the responsibility is very large on the G7 to play its major part in enabling this consensus to come about. When I take a look at the G7 foreign ministers' communique, for instance, again, what strikes me is that it is highly securitized. Of course, it goes without saying that all economic issues today are securitized. But this is a very, very potent politico-security kind of statement, the communique itself. For instance, the thrust is beginning with the war in Ukraine. It speaks of nuclear issues, peace and security, sanctions, Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, China, North Korea, Iran, Afghanistan. But let me remind you that the first reference to the SDGs is only on page 12 out of the 21 pages. That, to me, was striking. Economic resilience comes in paragraph 16 on page 14. Public, issues like the PGII, energy, environment is really to the very end. Food security is on page 19 out of 21, and gender equality and disaster risk reduction are last. The point I'm making is that when you look at the T20 process, or for instance in the G20, the foreign ministers meeting that took place and the chair's summary, you will see that it's exactly the opposite. It is the developmental issues that take priority, and it's not as if they don't mention the war in Ukraine or the other poly-crises that we face. So what is very clear to me is that the priorities of the G7 and G20 seem to be quite different. And what is it that we can do to bridge that gap? The G7 does not even refer to counterterrorism. The G20, of course, also puts counterterrorism front and center, for without there being peace and security, you cannot have development. And terrorism in any case today affects not just a few countries in the global south, but also the developed countries. So how do we, bridge this gap? I know that Japan has done its utmost at the level of its leadership to also reach out to the global south during the Golden Week. I believe Prime Minister Kishida will travel to Africa, and Foreign Minister Hayashi will go to Central and South America. So that shows the kind of importance that Japan attaches to this. A couple of suggestions, if you don't mind, the Chair. I think we should focus on shared concerns such as economic recovery, climate change, global health, financial stability, rebuilding these critical supply chains, etc. And some kind of joint research needs to be undertaken between the T7 and T20 on some of these key issues. For me, some of the greatest challenges lie in terms of what you can do about multilateralism, for instance. I mean, the General Assembly in the United Nations can agree to reforming the Security Council, but it will require 2/3 of the membership to take a call on that. And ratification is required not just by 2/3 of the membership, but also all 5 permanent members. You are never going to get that. So to try and imagine that you can have UN Security Council reforms is a chimera. In the GA Resolution 75-1 of September 2021, there is reference to reinvigorating multilateralism. But the need of the hour is not just to reinvigorate multilateralism, but to fundamentally reform it. Multilateralism is not working, period. Now, if you don't do something about it, it's going to be very difficult. The WTO has collapsed, whether it's negotiations or dispute settlement. When you look at the multinational development banks or the international financial institutions, you have a major problem there. If you have, for instance, reforms in the MDBs subject to approval by the US Congress or requires the approval of a single country, for instance, the United States, with 17.5% voting power, it's a no-brainer. It's never going to take off. So how do you then go about this kind of reform of multilateralism when you can't really change anything and the existing structures have not been working? So these are some critical sort of questions before me. I think we need to build better dialogue between the Bretton Woods structures and the parallel structures that have emerged. These parallel structures like the AIIB, for instance, or the BRICS New Development Bank, they are here to stay. Some of them ostensibly work on the basis of equality. I was looking at the New Development Bank's structure, and there they have equal voting rights. Not so in the AIIB. There, of course, China being the largest contributor has the biggest sort of decision-making authority. Be that as it may, I think we need to re-look the concept of the G7 within the G20. My word of caution here, on which I want to end, is that the G7, which purportedly is a structure born out of crisis in the 1970s, the economic crisis, the oil crisis, etc., is increasingly appearing to be like a UN Security Council. In fact, it has, and I'm not criticizing, I'm only stating a fact here, that it is increasingly speaking that language which, really in the Security Council has evaded consensus. That consensus is sought to be built within the G7, and the G7 maintains a very strong and tight line by proxy. It's a vicarious kind of, development. So where does that leave space for building consensus in the G20 is my worry. It's a very great concern I have, and I will do my best to, have a dialogue with you, with other colleagues, many of whom are better informed than I am, to see how do we take this process forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chinoy. You could speak in Japanese, but great insights. And I completely agree with you. We need more fora for discussion of this kind. And of course, the diplomats are working very hard, but the number of diplomats are limited. So more track to diplomacy will be very useful. And then let's move to Professor Bambam, who is one of the mentors of mine who recommended me strongly to work closely with T20 India. So, your turn.
Thank you, Dr. Sonube. Let me try to conclude what I can get from the three presenters or speakers. I think the conclusion is quite obvious. Both G7 and G20 need each other, because whatever G7 trying to do in order to solve the global problem, they will need other members of G20, the non-G7 members, as well as, of course, the support from the countries outside the G20. And then the G20, as Indian Sherpa mentioned, has a lot of issues to be done, SDG, climate change, etc., etc. So long list of issues that might not be solved only by G20 itself. So the support of the G7 will be critical. So in this case, our community, think tank community, will play an important role, because I happen to be in the government side of the G20 when I was in finance minister, as well as now in the think tank side. And the big difference is that, of course, when you are in the government side, you will come to any G20 forum as representation of your government, and you have to voice the government's opinion and government stance, and trying to negotiate with other members in order to come up with the G20 resolution or G20 communique. But when you are in the think tank community, in T20, and I was also involved in the T7 Germany last year, for example, then I can see that there is no such thing called delegation. There is no Indonesian delegation, Japan delegation, India delegation, German delegation, US delegation in the Think 20. The existing ones is the think tank institution itself or the individual, which I think it's a beauty of the think tank community. And by doing that, and I think Dr. Sonube mentioned very rightly in his opening speech, that think tank institution is usually small, much smaller, for example, than university. But then, think tank has a network, very strong network that can be even developed with the existence of T7 and T20, and becomes, I think, a good bridging point between G7 and G20. Of course, G7 and G20 might need each other, but the question is how to create the bridge between G7 and G20. And I still believe the existence of T7 and T20 can be the one that bridging both G7 and G20. Of course, with our own channel in each of its country or in the fora itself. For example, now, of course, the burden or responsibility will be on Dr. Sonube from T7 and Ambassador Chinoy from T20 to bridge the ideas between G7 and G20 and trying to bring it up after discussion among the T7 and T20 to the forum, to the formal forum of G7 and G20. And as Dr. Sonube mentioned, at the beginning of T7 process, I strongly recommend that both T7 and T20 would be so-called blended, quote unquote. Why it has to be blended? It's a nature of a think tank. If we are a think tanker, then the idea is how to get the exchange of ideas as wide as possible, and trying to meet not only, for example, I have a background as an economist. It's good if I meet other economists. But I think it's also good to listen from diplomats, listen from social scientists, or listen from even the defense analysts and others. Why? Because at the end of the day, the global issue is not just economic issue. Of course, economic issue will be dominating, and that's why G20 was formed a long time ago, similar with the G7. But then, the way to solve the global issue needs multidimensional approach. It cannot be only economic approach, but it has to be accompanied by other type of approaches. So my suggestion on the T7 and T20 relationship, I think Dr. Sonube mentioned about our Bellagio gathering. And thanks to the Rockefeller Foundation, we have this kind of gathering. This gathering is important because we are trying to understand each other between T7 and T20 about the priorities of respective G7 and G20 presidency. As Ambassador Chinoy mentioned, of course, find the relationship between the priorities of G7 and priorities of G20 with the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is trying to solve the global issues, especially the most recent or the kind of the highest priority issue. Maybe people now talking about climate change, energy transition, talking about digital transformation, and of course, global health resilience. But then we have to pick up at least one very, urgent issue. And in my opinion, again, biased as an economist, the issue is about supply side disruption that creates high inflation everywhere, including the developed economy, and basically triggering the high interest rate. It's not good for the recovery after COVID. So we have to find a way how to make recovery after COVID as smooth as possible. So every country can be back on their position prior to COVID. So I think that will be one of the issues that needs to be discussed. And we discuss a lot during our Bellagio gathering and come up with ideas that at least we are trying to solve as best as we can the global issues. And then, of course, we expect the T7 will convey our discussion to their G7 counterparts, and the T20 will convey to the G20 counterpart. And the ideas is, although the priority is different, but the spirit to solve the problem, solve the global problem is the same. With the ultimate goal, of course, we are talking about poverty alleviation, we are talking about many issues, but at the end of the day, we cannot forget there are still a lot of global issues need to be resolved. And of course, our role as a think tank, trying to contribute, although maybe our contribution cannot solve many of the issues, but at least give the light, give the spirit for everybody, not to create differences, but trying to find the common ground to find the solution itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bambam, for the very clear, easy to understand, but very comprehensive, very energetic messages. And now the bridging idea has been expanding. As I said, the strength of and also role of the think tanks is to bridge research and policy making. So naturally, our partner is science community. And then also, it's very important to listen to the voices of the people. So the civil society is also very key partners. And then Professor Takeuchi is a person who really bridge science and think tanks. So he's a great scholar, and at the same time, he's now leader of a think tank. So Takeuchi-sensei, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sonobe-san, for your kind introduction. I'm the president of IGES, Institute for Global Environment Strategies, and as well as the project professor at the University of Tokyo. I point to 3 areas where I think more action is needed to strengthen connection between G7 and G20. The first area involves meaningfully listening to the voices of the Global South, which is very important. Listening to all countries and stakeholders can lead to more inclusive and effective policies that can benefit everyone, particularly those who are marginalized. The second area involves a science policy interface. And I think that think tank will play a key role in this interface between the science and policy. It is crucial to bring the gap between science research and policy implementation to arrive at evidence-based solutions to pressing global challenges. Bridging these gaps can also help not only shape more effective, efficient, and equitable policies, but also build trust across the G7 and G20. The third area that can help strengthen connections between the G7 and G20 involves synergetic approaches to environmental challenges. There is a growing recognition that complex problems such as climate change, pollution control, and nature conservation cannot be solved in silos. Rather, we need to aim for multiple benefits. For example, the use of cleaner cooking technology can not only improve air quality and health, but also mitigate climate change in India. We are collaborating with the Indian think tank, which is called TERI, for these discussions. At the same time, we also need to manage possible conflict. For example, there are some tensions between nature conservation and the installation of solar panels. In Japan, particularly, we can see this problem in Hokkaido. By becoming more aware of synergies and conflict, we can not only build bridges across issues, but also the G7 and G20. To offer some additional suggestions on how we can leverage the three above areas: one, listening to the Global South, and strengthening the science policy interface is second, and third is promoting synergies. Researchers at IGES collaborated with the several institutions on two policy briefs, the G7 processes. Let me briefly summarize the message from these briefs, as I think they can also foster cooperation between the G7 and G20. The first brief urges the societal being should be placed at the core of the climate actions in G7 and beyond. Many interventions such as social protection, universal health coverage, quality education for all, and the gender equality can bring well-being into the center of the climate actions. The brief further urged that multidimensional well-being indicators, which is beyond GDP, and institutional fiscal reforms can enable the integration of well-being into climate actions. A second output led by IGES stresses the importance of synergies between the G7 and G20 in working on critical minerals. As the demand for critical minerals grows, questions arise about their socio-economic, environmental, and supply security implementations. Therefore, G7 and G20 summits need to align national and multilateral strategies as well as finance and investment policies to promote sustainable practices and ensure critical mineral supply chain resilience. The participants, I firmly believe that Japan and India, holding the presidency of G7 and G20 respectively, can work together to abandon many of points outlined in my remarks. This will require creating opportunities to truly listen to each other, enhancing links between science and policy, and strengthening synergy in policies and practices. It will also entail broader effects to place societal well-being at the center of the climate actions and targeted efforts to address concerns over critical minerals. Finally, it will require that Japan and India commit to collaborative forms of leadership that help the planet and its people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Takeshi-sensei. So the comprehensive, but also including the very important specific issues as well. And then now let me ask Professor Takamura for sharing her ideas.
Thank you, Sonube Sensei. On behalf of the Science Council Japan, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the organizer of T7, starting with Sonube Sensei and Hitomi-san for kind invitation. It is really a great honor of us to be a part of this panel. And also, I'm personally delighted to see the quite familiar faces in this site that shows that the possible, the more intense collaboration possibility between the S7 and T7. So maybe let me introduce briefly the Science Council of Japan and the S7, Science 7. The Science Council of Japan is a leading organization of the Japanese scientific community, actually covering the broad range of scientists in the field of humanities and social sciences, life sciences, physical sciences, and engineering. Since 2005, national academies of G7 countries, recently called Science 7, S7, started to work together. They aiming to bring scientific knowledge and expertise into the political decision and discussion by G7 political leaders for the betterment of the world. I think you can see some kind of common sense shared even by the T7 people, I understand. So this year, we elaborated the 3 joint statements, which is one is the addressing systematic risk in the changing climate and resilience. The second, and delivering the better health and the well-being of elder people. And last but not least is restoration and the recovery of the ocean, its biodiversity. I think it's, of course, we find it critically important for the G7 political leaders' discussion, but of course, it is true for the G20 political leaders. So excuse me. The G7 national academies representative already met our Prime Minister, Kishida, and we hand over this statement to Prime Minister last March. So back into the question from Chair, I think like other speakers, I couldn't agree more that collaboration between G7 and G20 are critically important and gaining more importance than ever. Crises and challenges that our society faces. For instance, I think everyone told that climate change and sustainable society are global in nature and require more intensive and close collaboration across borders to tackle effectively these challenges. Take up some numbers. G20 economies are responsible for around 80% of global GHG emissions. Of course, G20 include G7 economies. Around 2/3 of world population live in a G20 country. Together, the G20 economy produces around 80% of global GDP. So it is quite clear that the G7 and G20 countries have capability as well as responsibility to tackle these global challenges. So turning to our effort, Science Council of Japan, of course, is a member of the S7, Science 7, and S20. So the Science Council of Japan and the S7 academies have actively participated in both fora, the S7 and S20. For instance, in 2019, when Japan hosted G20, actually the Science Council of Japan, under the leadership of the Professor Takeuchi, at that time he was the vice president of the Science Council of Japan as my predecessor, so took the lead to deliver the policy recommendation around ocean and plastic pollution. We consider that that have a significant impact of the creation of the Osaka Blue Ocean Vision to tackle the marine plastic pollution. So since a couple of years, we are officially and unofficially, invite the representative of the S20. Then this year, when we met last March, we invited the Indian National Science Academy, Vice President of Indian National Science Academy, Professor and Dr. Mehra, and he provided quite insightful input to our recommendation. And we, of course, the strengths do more effort to strengthen the collaboration between S7 and S20 through that to make more impact on the discussion, G7 and G20. Maybe that will be the second part of discussion in the panel. What I'm thinking is that as I said, that I see a quite familiar face here in the conference room. That shows that we have more possibility in terms of the collaboration with the engagement groups, starting with the T7, because scientists belong to the both overlapped, and the interest and the contribution and responsibility to society is shared. So that maybe that might be the second part of the discussion in the panel, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Takamura. I have an additional question to you. So while the T7, T20 are very open to the think tanks and the researchers in the world, but science group, science academy is really close to the member countries and also science, academic, how to say, those groups like Royal Society, so kind of elite group, limited. And because of your fixed membership, you have good relationship, of course, with those science academies in non-G7, G20 member countries. But still, is there any significant difference in opinion between the G7 side, G20, non-G7, G20 groups? Yes. Or Takeuchi-sensei.
Definitely yes. But I think what is the challenge that our society globally faces, I think it's quite commonly shared. But how to tackle these challenges, I think there are quite a diversity of view, even among national academies of the G7. Of course, beyond, I mean, the S20, I mean, the G20 country, National Academy of G20 countries. But deliberation among us, that is, I think, already important and good starting point to find more, the better solution for the society. So I think
Sonube-san pointed at a very important point because G7 covers many countries, but not all the countries. And many developing countries, particularly
you mean G20?
These developing countries, they need to be involved in our discussion. And one of the possibilities is try to invite the tours to our arena. Tours is only for the least developed countries. So this is another academic society that we are collaborating. And the Science Council of Japan already has a contact with them. And so I think in the future, we can invite them to our arena, T7 or T20.
Thank you very much. Now, Kinai-san, thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Sonube-san. So much has been said, so I'm wondering if there is any leftover issue that I can mention at this time. But as a member of the C7, I can't really agree more that pursuing greater engagement between the G7, G20, or even beyond is very necessary. I support this idea mainly for two reasons. One of the reasons is around that legitimacy. Now I'm trying to be a little bit provocative because I'm from the civil society group. And legitimacy of the G7 has been, questioned for long because G7, like, Professor Takama mentioned about the G20, but I'm now focusing on the G7. The G7, the population accounts only for 10% of the world population, while their economy accounts for 43% of the world GDP. It means clearly they have significant impact and responsibility to the world peace and global prosperity. But the question is, can they really represent the interests of all over the world appropriately? That's the question. And this is, I think, that one of the backgrounds and the reasons why different engagement groups like T7, S7, C7, and then there are other Y7 for youth, women, W7 for women, and they have set up the new engagement group called Pride 7, which is a group to protect the human rights for the LGBTQIA+ people. And so that is the one of the backgrounds why these different engagement groups have been established. Our role is to really bring the different perspectives in the formal policy recommendations to the G7 so that their policies and actions will have more relevance and impact, positive impact to the society on the ground. So far, each of the 7 engagement groups, as I mentioned, there is a clear justification or requirement to engage G20 countries. Having said this, now I would like to challenge or pose a question to Sonube and the T7 colleagues by asking which extent T7 is aiming to enlarge their engagement or collaboration. C7, our group this year, enjoyed working with more than 700 people, members of the citizens and NGOs and NPOs from 75 countries, of which around 50 are from Global South. And in fact, this engagement has been expanding quite significantly recently. The number of the participants we had in C20 in Osaka 2019 was 400 from 30 countries. Therefore, C7, our group's priorities is really to bridge the G7 countries and then other countries across the world, even beyond the G7 countries. Because as Ms. Renana said at the beginning, though we have similar issues, we need to recognize the differences of our circumstances for developing solutions. So we are to bring our different diverse perspectives, amplify their voices, and reflect them into the G7 policies and actions so that the policies will have more relevance and effectiveness to the people's lives on the ground. And in this regard, we very much appreciate Ambassador Nakamura's presence in our C7 summit 2 weeks ago. He actually spent 2 full hours sitting solely on the stage, receiving so many hundreds of questions and comments from civil society people, and trying to share his perspective as a Tsusherpa of the government presidency. And it was really fruitful. I think it was a very difficult time for him, and I'm very sorry for him, but it was really fruitful time. And I think that was only a kind of the occasion or situation we can pursue our mutual understanding to come up with the new solution to tackle these diverse, complicated global issues right now. The second reason that I would like to support the idea of the T7 to enlarge engagement is probably we can come up with the better impacts if we collaborate wisely. 2 weeks ago, we had this C7 summit in Tokyo as well, and we invited the representatives for the T7, Mr. Sonube. Thank you very much for coming at that time. Labor 7, Pride 7, Women 7, and Youth 7. And then we also have a message from Professor Takamura for that occasion. And at that time, we realized different engagement groups, although we have different focuses, but we share common value. We value environment, we value sustainable planet, we value people. We have common goal, that is a society with leaving no one behind. So expected outcome for the collaboration between these different engagement groups would be we can inspire each other. I think the T7's the main role is to inspire people to make them transformed, to inspire people to change themselves. So inspire each other by bringing a diverse perspective. We can improve the quality of our policy recommendations by doing so, and amplify the voices, probably the unheard voices of people and stakeholders, as Professor Takeuchi mentioned in his presentation, to reflect into the recommendations. So that is, maybe I can stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I always respect Kinai-san's very high ability to synthesize the argument and going to the core of the arguments and then explain it very clearly. So thank you very much. So I think this lineup was really correct. So putting you at the end was right decision, I think. Then, as I said, so because of the openness of the think tank engagement group to the researchers and think tanks in the world, so I thought, essentially the participants of T7 and the T20 are the same people. So then there would be the same arguments and very similar discussions. But actually, so T7 and T20 are significantly different, surprisingly. So that's the interesting part. Then why such a big difference exists just because of the organizers' difference. So, because I'm a development economist and a fieldwork type economist, so I stay in developing country maybe 1/3 of the year, every year for more than 20, almost 30 years. And then I visit those small business people, just like the people in the photos shown by Renana. So I thought that I'm pretty familiar with and knowledgeable about the way of thinking of the developing countries people. But when I talked with Ambassador Chinoy and Professor Bambang about the priority of T7, T20 discussions, especially the security issues, very, very different. Because many Japanese immediately thought after the outbreak of the war in the Ukraine, so many Japanese just thought about the Taiwan. If the Ukraine, Russia's invasion is allowed, then what will happen next? So in that way, okay, of course, this war must be stopped. But the ambassador and professor said, that's just one of the regional conflicts. So why the G7 just focus on that only? So yes, that's right. So I think it's initially I thought, it's easy to say and also easy to have joint statements between T7 and T20, but it may not be so easy. But nonetheless, we have to overcome those differences, and then we should have maybe very nice joint statements about some issues. Then, so I'd like to ask Ambassador Chinoy and the Professor Bambang about what would be the joint statement topic, and then other panelists, please respond to their comments.
Thank you very much, Chair. Once again, going by what the eminent panelists have just said, there seems to be a suggestion that given the fact that the G7 and G20, though actually part of the same monolith, behave differently, and the G7 behaves differently both within the G20 and outside of it, I think the key question here is to disaggregate what is possible and what is not possible from what is not possible. And I think the one common agenda that seems to be suggested by the panelists is also to give better representation to the needs of the global South. I think this is something that comes out as a requirement not only of the G7 but also of the G20. The G7, of course, is inviting emerging economies like India and Brazil for the Hiroshima summit. And you are aware that the G20, under India's presidency, has also cast its net far and wide. In fact, both within the country where it's been made a people's G20 and globally as well, India is inviting a very large number of other countries from the global South. But neither the G7 nor the G20 will still be adequately representing the global South as people have suggested. So then, therefore, I think the common part really for the G7, G20 or T7 and T20 is to focus more on things that have already been attempted, including by the G7. For instance, the G7 has already spoken of the Global Food Security Alliance, for instance. That's a very laudable initiative. The Just Energy Transition Partnership, where countries like India, Indonesia, Senegal, Vietnam have come in. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is, to my mind, like a parallel option being offered today in a world in which binary choices are forcing the global South into very difficult situations. They've got their backs up against the wall there. So the PGII, for instance, is again a G7 initiative which can be supported, in my view, by the G20 as a whole. Resilient democracies statement also. There I am a little concerned because of the interpretations that can be given to the word democracy. I've said this before, even in the context of the quadrilateral security dialogue, that please don't keep harping on democracy, because there are countries that have their own versions of democracy, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, the democracy that's practiced in Germany or France is not going to be the same as the very vibrant democracy in Asia, for instance, in Japan or in India. So I think there I'm a little concerned, for that can be the thin end of the wedge in terms of bringing in, once again, the narrative of good governance and human rights and all that is eventually divisive. So I think we should look at global South priorities. The one thing that really disturbs me is not only the fact that, as I said before, the G7 is not going to be able to really reform anything because of its structure. Its inherent structure involves some of the very privileged members of the Security Council who have sought exceptionalism elsewhere. I see no reason why they would permit the G7 to move forward on fundamental reforms of anything. So the roadblocks that we see in the Security Council and elsewhere in the WTO or in the MDBs are going to be seen within the G7. So therefore, it's in the G7's interest to shift gear and move towards what is possible with regard to the global South. And in the digital space, it's very disturbing for me as a novice to this field that the entire digital techno-economic architecture that's emerging in the world today is also leading to some kind of a digital colonization. And so maybe we can give some thought to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Professor Bambang.
Yeah, I still believe that G7 and G20 should be complementary one to another. And if we can, let's say, divide the G20, it consists of the so-called advanced economy with high-income countries, and also another group is called EMDE, Emerging Market and Developing Economy. So of course, those two groups, need to complement to each other in order to solve the global issues. That's why I think if we try to come up with the so-called joint communique or joint resolution between T7 and the T20, the complementarity has to be there. And what is the basis of complementarity? I was inspired actually by Ambassador Chinoy when we met in Bellagio in one of the occasions, and also reiterated by the India Sherpa. We already have so-called sustainable development goals. Everybody in UN or task force already come up with a very good 17 goals of SDG that very comprehensive. And those 17 goals actually represent those complementarity. If you like to discuss the issue, Dr. Sonube mentioned about security issue, goal 17 is there, talking about the security and of course the peace. And then of course we have typical issues of low-income country as well as developing economy, poverty alleviation, food security is also there, goal number 1, goal number 2, and then we have issues after COVID, global health resilience is also there, goal about the health. And then if many already concerned about energy transition, climate change, there are, I think, 4 goals related to the environment, both on the surface and below water. So it means everything is there, everything has been documented very well, but sometimes we forget SDG is there. And so we forget that SDG is supposed to be kind of the desired goal of global community. And I think it is the task of our community, think tank community, both at T7 and T20, to make sure SDG is still there and SDG will still be pursued. And SDG will benefit everybody, not only low income or developing economy, but also developed economy. Don't forget, for example, if we travel especially to US, some part of US, we feel there is a big income inequality in US, in some cities in US. So there is a goal about income inequality that will be addressed very well under Sustainable Development Goals. So I think, Dr. Sonube, I think it's quite clear. We could be trying to come up with a kind of joint statement, but it has to represent the complementarity spirit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, other panelists, do you have any quick response? If not, then I will ask, the people in this room. So, not soon, and then also Renana, if you have a quick response, please raise your hand. Is there anyone who want to say, okay, yeah, please introduce yourself very briefly.
Oh, hello everyone, good morning. My name is Bilawal Hussain and I'm from Pakistan. I'm working here as a consultant with the Pacific Consultants. I have a question about the lack of inclusivity of G20. I personally think like G20 is composed of world's largest economies, which means the smaller countries are excluded from the decision making. For instance, Pakistan is nowhere, not in G7, not in G20. So my question is, how would you address these kind of issues? And how would you address the inclusivity in terms of multilateral agreements? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. From voice from Pakistan, Anika.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the panel very, very much.
Introduce yourself.
I know. I'm Stormy Miltner. I'm with the Aspen Institute in Germany, and I've been involved in the T20 and T7, and before that in the B7 and B20. And we heard that multilateralism is facing a lot of different challenges, and it's not working really well anymore. But we also have a lot of global problems and also a lot of global comments. And we need multilateralism really to address these. So my question is, if we can't get any consensus in the multilateral institutions, are plurilateral agreements within those institutions or outside a way forward? And what would be the criteria to make them transparent, accountable, and also inclusive?
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So it's not a question, but just I want to support whatever the panelists said and the question.
Who are you?
I am Himangana Gupta. I am from United Nations University, Research Fellow and Academic Associate. My expertise is on climate change, but the question that I'm going to put, or the discussion, is more global. So I feel that the as already pointed out, that G7 is a part of G20, and many countries from G20 are a part of G77. And I totally feel that it's a responsibility of the G group, G20 group, G7 group, to be inclusive of all those countries that need more support and more, they're facing more the brunt of climate change, they're facing more issues to achieve SDGs, so they need to be supported. So T7, T20 need to delimit themselves to move beyond these boundaries of, the countries and look for more global solutions. I think is already happening, but just suggestion. Thank you.
What kind of support would be most effective?
Yeah, that's for the, I'd say that yes, the T7 needs to think what kind of support they need, but since I'm expert in climate change, so I would speak from the climate perspective. Of course, the loss and damage is increasing, and we already have the loss and damage finance facility. We need to think that from these countries, if there is a country who can become the secretariat of the fund, I think Japan is the only country from among the top 10 climate vulnerable countries that faces the maximum loss and damage. I think there's no other developed country in that list. All others are developing countries. So maybe we need to think if there's a country who can support that kind of a secretariat, then there are issues regarding gender equity that is important from the point of view of climate change. Again, because women face more issues of climate change, they are the caregivers. And then the issue of equity and just transition. So these are the issues which we have to think that how to support the equity, how to support just transition in these countries, and what decisions that are taken at the level of G20 or G7 impact those countries. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Another person?
My name is Kim Schmirker. I'm an associate professor at Kyushu University in Sustainable Finance and ESG. My research focuses on greenwashing, so a lot of talk, very little walk. So I wonder, is there something that could amount to sovereign greenwashing? So basically, countries, because greenwashing is basically just making immaterial progress look like progress. And lots of talk, lots of summits, lots of groups. I even lost track of C7, C20, T. So I wonder, is there a thing like such as sovereign greenwashing, and how can we fight it? Because countries, if they do not make progress, might want to present their little progress as a success. So is there such a thing, and what do the participants think we can do to fight it? And that is my question, so yeah.
Thank you very much. And then Munir from Bangladesh.
Thank you. Professor Munir Khusru, Institute of Policy Advocacy Governance. I think what Ambassador China has said is quite correct, and I have had the privilege to meet the G20 Sherpa India last month, and I appreciate India's drive in trying to bring forward the developing global south. But let's face the facts. There are two angles to G7, G20. Geopolitical, political angle, development, and the cooperative angle. First one is always a little tricky, and there will always be divergences. So I would strongly urge, let's focus on the forces of convergence. And it's better to be realistic and have few low-hanging fruits to target And Japan and India are two economic powerhouses of Asia and have a very strong bilateral relationships. So if any two countries between G7 and G20 can bring together, it's the two countries, Japan and India, which currently at think tank level you both represent. So I would suggest focus on 5 low-hanging fruits. One, SDG 2030, which is hanging by the thread, and we know even now we are far off the target. 2, the climate change issue, energy transition. 3rd, the digital transformation. 4th, putting a gender lens to 4 of the above. So I would say let's try to be realistic, and as Ambassador China said very aptly in his opening remarks, and which you also echoed, so let's try to focus on the forces of convergence, and T7, T20 come together, focusing on these 5 or maybe 1 or 2 areas, and leave the first part, the geopolitics, politics part, to the leader themselves. It will be quite tricky for us at think tank level to try to influence that discourse. So that would be my hopefully realistic proposition, bringing together G7, G20 through the track T7, 220. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there have been questions about inclusiveness and accountability, transparency, and greenwash, and then the climate, and then the what? Yes. So thank you very much. So is there any response from the panelists? Yes, please.
So I wouldn't answer to maybe all of your questions, but regarding the inclusiveness. So we definitely are aware of the constraints we have in both in the G7 and G20 context to be genuinely inclusive. So that is precisely why in working in the G7 context and in addressing various global challenges such as food security, global health architecture, digital transformation, etc., we are not thinking not only in exclusive G7 context or not only in the exclusive G7, G20 bridging context, but even broadly. For example, take the example of the climate change and energy transition. So both in the G7 and the G20, definitely the representation for example, of the small island states are lacking. So we always bear in mind that in discussing and addressing those questions, we always have to think about those categories of sort of non-representative groups of state situation. And that partly explains that our G7 presidency's choice of the invited countries, where this year invited Cook Islands as well as Comoros from Africa, both of which are island states. Of course, we couldn't invite furthermore, such as our distinguished Pakistani colleagues, but in such context and as constraints, we are trying our best to listening carefully from a broader range of international partners. And that is partly to respond to your question. Thank you.
Lucky because of the good relationship between bilateral relationship between Japan and India, but and then also because of that, we hope we can kind of establish very good example precedent to the future, G7 and the G20 or T7, T20, endeavors. And then part of because of that, this conference have those delegates from Italy, which will be the presidents of the G7 next year, and then Brazil, the G20, and then after Brazil presidency will go to South Africa. So we are inviting those people. So I hope there will be some kind of continuity, and then this effort will be continued to be made by those presidencies. And I would like to thank all the panelists and presenters. Renana, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Sherpa Amitabh Kant and Elizabeth from the Rockefeller Foundation. And thank you very much, everyone, for being very carefully listening and also engaging with this discussion. Thank you very much. And let's have a nice lunch, which is also opportunity for networking. Okay. And we will have more and more great discussions afternoon.
Thank you very much. And this concludes our morning session.